Introducing to the stage Axios congressional reporter Elena Treen.
Morning. Thank you all for being here. Welcome to our special pre-midterms New Shapers event. Today, we'll be discussing all of the big topics in the news right now, from next week's high-stakes midterm elections to the latest power shift happening across the pond in the United Kingdom. We would love for you to join the conversation on Twitter at our event hashtag, Axios Events. And before we begin, a big thank you to our event sponsor, Bank of America. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the stage our first guest, the former Republican governor of New Jersey. She was also the EPA administrator under the George W. Bush administration and is now a big critic of her former party, the GOP. Please welcome to the stage Governor Christine Todd Whitman. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for being here today. We were just talking behind stage about how this is the Super Bowl for a lot of people in this room, and including yourself. I'm also very honored to be here with you as a Jersey girl myself, so lots to talk about. I wanted to get started, though, Governor. You've been a Republican political figure for decades, and you recently announced that you're launching a new independent party called Forward alongside former Democratic presidential candidate Andrew Yang. I'm curious, what motivated you to form this party after being a Republican for so long?
Well, I was watching what was happening with the political system in our country and what was happening with our parties. I don't think there's a Republican Party anymore. Frankly, it's a cult. It did not adopt a platform at the 2020 convention, so there's no set of central principles on which it's based. It's whatever Donald Trump says people should believe at any particular moment, and that's what they do. So that's not my definition of a party. And when I wrote my book in 2005, It's My Party Too, I was worried about this very thing happening. And watching what was going on, it was clear that we needed to do something different. So I started with the Renew America movement, and we began as Republicans who were trying to bring the Republican Party back to the center on the basis that this country does best when you have a center-right and a center-left party. But the centers were being split off. I mean, people were going more and more to the extremes. And so we realized early on at RAM that, in fact, it wasn't just Republicans that we needed centrist Democrats too. So we were already starting to look at and endorse candidates from both sides of the aisle who were willing to work together, who respected the rule of law, who believed in the Constitution. And then Andrew Yang was working with his Forward Party, doing the same kind of thing. And then David Jolly, the Save America movement. And again, we were all looking for the center. We figured, we need to be together because that's the way to do it. It has to be bipartisan. It has to be Republicans. It has to be Democrats. We just want people who are going to work together, who believe in those principles. And for us now at Forward, the only two actual positions that we ask people to agree to is to support open primaries and ranked choice voting. Because if we don't change the system, we're never going to be able to change the outcome. So we're working with our candidates, the candidates that we've endorsed from Forward. We've endorsed Republicans, Democrats, Independents across the board. And we're trying to remind people there are 500,000 elective offices across this country. And in 2020, 70% of those were uncontested. That's just wrong. Everybody should have a choice. And that's where we're focusing, is on those elections, not so much on 2024. Everybody thinks about that. And not so much on the we endorse congressional candidates and senatorial candidates, but we're also endorsing down ballot because those are every bit as important.
I'm curious, Governor, since Forward is not formally registered yet, how are you voting next week? And are you an independent? Are you still a registered Republican? How do you expect to vote in next week's elections?
I'm a registered Republican, but I'd vote as an independent because I vote for the person. And I have been doing that for a while. There are people within the Republican Party whom I respect and support, and there are people within the Republican Party that I don't and I won't support. So I base it on the candidate.
Mm-hmm. going back to talking about Forward, there have been several attempts in the past to launch a third party, many of which have failed.
Right.
And there's always a concern as well that an independent party will siphon a lot of votes, particularly away from Democrats and the centrist figures you're discussing. Why do you think Forward is different, and how do you think it can succeed when so many others haven't?
Sure. Well, there's several reasons. It's right now as much a movement as a party, because we are in getting people together to say, you deserve another choice between these two parties. We're in a different place today. Over 60% of Americans say they'd welcome a third opportunity, and better than 50%, or right around 50% of registered voters are registered independent. Mm-hmm. That's never happened in the country before. So there's a hunger there for something different. The other third-party efforts have been largely based on one person or one set of ideas, a Green Party. I mean, one set of issues. We're broader than that. We're looking to get on the ballot in 15 states by the end of this year, 30 by the end of next year, and hopefully all of them in 2024, 2025. But this is going to take a long time. Mm-hmm. It's not going to happen overnight. We recognize that. We're focused, as I said before, on the down ballots, because frankly, what happens in state legislatures, what happens at the local level, those are the people that make decisions that affect your life most immediately and most directly. And then they have a huge impact as you're building up. So it's important to get people to understand that those races, they need to focus on those. And we all tend to think of elections as being national, but they're run by the states. And in this election cycle, it's become particularly important. And we're working hard on this to get people to understand what a Secretary of State, a state's Attorney General, or a governor does, what their ability is to affect how elections are handled. Mm-hmm. I mean, you have states now, you have 18 candidates for governor, Republican, who are election deniers. Right. You have 10 candidates across the country running for Attorney General who are election deniers, and you have 12 states where you have election deniers running for Secretary of State. What we're trying to say is, do you really want to put in place a person who doesn't believe in the system, to have them oversee the system? Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? And you should understand the importance of that and who they are. But as a party, we don't feel we have to have candidates in every race. And we're never going to feel that. We feel, and that's why we won't be spoilers, because if you have someone who believes in our principles running against someone who's way out, right or left, we won't play in that race. That's fine. We'll get behind the one who believes as we do, and will support the issues that we think are important. But beyond that, we're really about ensuring that every race does have a challenge. So there's somebody else there, and the importance of of electoral reform just in general. But particularly, we think open primaries and ranked choice voting would make a huge difference.
Mm-hmm. And what about, I know you said you're focused on down ballot races, but will you put forward a candidate for 2024 in the presidential race?
No idea.
Have you thought about who you might want?
No, because that's not where we are.
Okay.
I mean, we are really, that's what makes us different. We really aren't focused on that. And who knows what's going to happen? Who knows who the candidates are? If it is two extremes, maybe we will. But of course, you have other groups that are focused on that exclusively, on the presidential. Mm-hmm. And so we'll leave it to them to do that.
Right. I'm curious, and we were just talking with Mike about this backstage. You're kind of the definition of sanity. You're preaching sanity right now across the country when so many Republicans are wrapped up in this new wave of disinformation, and we're seeing a lot of threats to democracy. I'm curious, I know we saw Liz Cheney this week come out and support and endorse Alyssa Slotkin, Tim Ryan. I'm curious if there's others like her. Do you think this movement of people starting to speak out, is it a movement, I guess I should say? And also, who do you find to be the most admirable political leaders, and particularly Republicans right now in the country?
Well, I'd have to say Liz Cheney. I mean, I didn't agree with her particularly on a lot of her stands when she was she still is in Congress, but when she was more aligned with Trump on issues. But boy, has she shown herself to be a patriot and someone who believes in standing up for principle. Mm-hmm. And there's just nothing. Kinzinger, the same way. Unfortunately, he chose not to run for re-election, but the same thing that happened to Liz Cheney would probably have happened to him. And so he's stepping aside. But those are the kinds of people that we really support. And then you look around the country and you have a number of races where you have former Republicans who have become independents who are now running. Evan McMullin in Utah is someone that we have supported. Fingers crossed that he can do better than the current polls are showing, but we're working hard for him. And those are the kinds of people that we think deserve to be heard, and the public needs to know about them and understand that we can build. It's going to take time. I'm fearful that this is going to be an ugly election as far as I'm concerned on the kind of people I'd like to see take office. So it'll be a rough 2 years until we can do something about it again. But in that time frame, there's a part of me that says, I hope all the crazies do win and everybody has to live with that for a while and see how much they like it. But then I realized, no, I don't want to have to live in that world, and I don't want to leave it for my grandkids either, the damage they can do. So if it goes the way that it looks like it might, with Republicans taking control of the House and hopefully not the Senate, but there's a possibility of that, it's going to be a rough 2 years, but it also give us an opening to really let people know what a difference elections make, how important it is to vote, and to consider those candidates and to understand what they mean for the future and policy making.
Now, I'm curious, Governor, if you were to run this year or in the current political environment, do you think you could win as a Republican?
Oh, I wouldn't be a Republican. The Republican Party would never nominate me.
Right.
I am a complete anathema as far as they're concerned.
Would you ever run again? I mean,
no.
If you were, but I mean in the sense of, if this was your time when you were trying to be governor, would you ever have run in the first place? If this was the
I mean, I ran for
politics?
governor because I wanted to make a difference and I wanted to do things for the state and correct some things that I thought were very wrong. If that were the case today, yes, of course, I'd still run no matter what the odds are. I mean, when I ran for the U.S. Senate in 1990, the odds were huge against me because I was running against Bill Bradley, who was going to be the next Democrat presidential candidate, and he'd beaten his first re-election opponent by 16 percentage points. But I knew what I wanted to do, and I went ahead and did it. So yeah, I would, but I certainly wouldn't be a Republican candidate. They wouldn't nominate me.
To get into a little bit of the Jersey politics, to our shared relationship, some of your successors, I guess, unlike you, are still very ambitious. We know Governor Chris Christie, for example, still wants to be a candidate. And what do you think about that? Do you think he has a shot at running or in this political environment?
Oh, I think he definitely wants to run, and he's got a record to point to. I think he has a challenge in that he's become a huge Trump critic, but he was such a Trump supporter for so long that that's going to be a challenge for him to weave his way through as to how that change came about. But he's someone who can be competitive.
Do you speak with him ever? Do you still talk to him at all? Or?
I talk to him from time to time. We run into one another, but we don't have a regular conversation or anything.
Okay. And I know we only have a little bit of time left, so I want to ask you about the state of democracy. I know we touched on this briefly, but you're doing so much work to promote continuing democracy and to, free and fair elections and whatever else. I mean, what do you think is the next step? Obviously the midterm elections and putting the right candidates in place, but what can reporters, everyday citizens be doing to better make sure that democracy is protected?
Well, one of the most important things, and we say it a lot at States United Democracy Center, that I also co-chair, and that is an organization that is absolutely non-political. We're working with states' attorneys general and governors and secretaries of state to help them push back against some of these efforts to undermine confidence in the vote. I mean, we need to keep reminding people the 2020 election was safe, secure, and accurate. And there's no denying that. And it happened in the middle of a pandemic with an administration, with a president who'd been saying for decades before that election was going to be stolen. If he didn't win, elections were going to be stolen. When Mitt Romney didn't win, Donald Trump was saying clearly the election was stolen. We need to remind people that we have a system that works And we don't need to keep passing these laws that are undermining the public's ability to vote. And that everybody who is legally eligible to vote should be able to vote. The good news is that over 70% of Americans say they'd rather have every vote counted than have their candidate win. And so that's what we need to appeal to, and we need to follow what States United is doing, because we're just the facts. I mean, there's no partisan overlay in that at all. And Forward is a political movement. States United is not. It's very different. But really what you're doing now in helping to educate people on the importance of elections, on all elections, the importance of educating people on what the various offices do, because we don't teach civics anymore, and half the people have no idea that a Secretary of State has any oversight. Of course, it varies from state to state how much influence they have on the election, but they clearly are involved in the election. And we need to have the backs of the people that are willing to stand up and continue to protect the system, because very often all I hear is the critics, and they're being physically threatened now. And you have people who are just doing their job, just counting ballots, just overseeing how the election progresses, and they're having to protect themselves. People have had to move, people have had to hire guards, and we saw what happened with Paul Pelosi. That's this kind of activism, this kind of unleashing of passions in a way that allows for not just verbal abuse, but physical abuse as well, has got to stop. And we need to tell people how dangerous it is.
And we're out of time, but two very quick yes or no questions. One, do you think President Biden is doing a good job right now? And two, do you think he should run again?
No to the second. I think he's too old. Depends. And there's really not a yes or no to is a president doing a good job, because you'll say yes on some things and no on others.
Yeah, maybe it's an unfair that a yes or no, but we'll have to leave it there, Governor. Thank you so much for your time today. I think this was a really great conversation. I appreciate you being here.
My pleasure.
And now, please enjoy a video from our sponsor, Bank of America.
Some soldiers come back with wounds you can see, but many of us come back with wounds you can't see. I retired from the military in 2012. I spent 39 months deployed, and that surrealness of being in a combat zone, coming back into the civilian world was tough. A lot of dark years fighting off PTSD, and I had to really go outside of the scope, and I had to struggle with this notion of who I was, who I could be. Let me show you what I do to get rid of those demons. It really just started out as a hobby in the basement, making clothes for my wife. And we got a tremendous response. So my first runway was spring of 2017 for Denver Fashion Week. And it's exploded since then. We are now focused on what we need to do as a small business and growing that into something global.
Small businesses are the majority of businesses in Denver and in Colorado and nationwide. And a lot of veterans are starting small businesses. We're one of the largest lenders to the CDFIs, Community Development Financial Institutions in the country. And we partner with CDFIs like Colorado Enterprise Fund on our Veteran Entrepreneur Lending Program to connect veterans with affordable capital to help kickstart and grow their businesses.
The soldiers don't become fashion designers generally, but Bank of America was the one from the beginning that says, hey, we believe in what you're doing, and we've created a program just for you. Let me connect you with the Colorado Enterprise Fund.
Not only is he able to get that access to capital, but we also provide a training program and a mentoring program to help him get to the next level.
It's really about, we really want you to succeed. And they've been supportive ever since. They've attended the shows. They're really a part of the journey.
It's really wonderful to see Dwayne be able to have his business just take off.
That's the fun part about my job, meeting passionate business owners like Dwayne, and we can't wait to see where Dwayne takes his business and his career.
You know what? I've had a rough journey. I've overcome some obstacles, but I love what I do now. You have the power to choose your path. You have the power to choose who you are, and you have the power to find your own switch. Turn that light on and shine.
Please welcome to the stage Axios political reporter Alexi McCammon.
Everyone, good morning. It's so good to see you in person. Thanks for joining us. Our next guest is the president and CEO of Voto Latino, a nonprofit group that works to educate, energize, and mobilize Latino voters of all backgrounds to go out to the polls. Please help me in welcoming Maria Teresa Kumar. Hi. Good to see you. Thank you for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
Well, how are you? We have 6 days until the election. Are you freaking out?
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. You know, the good thing about the work that we do is that we're in the moment of deployment, and we are looking every single morning at the polls and how close it is. In certain areas, when you look at the Latino vote, it shouldn't be as close as it is, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But you know, in 2020, Voto Latino invested $35 million in voter registration and GOTV. As a default, we became the largest voter registration outfit in the country, not by a little, but sixfold. And so in a place like Arizona, we registered and turned out 32,000 individuals. 19,000 of them were first-time voters. You all know how that state came in. And when we look at Arizona today, by default, you're seeing 50% of young people going out to the polls as of last Thursday compared to 2018. And we're seeing a dip in about 20% of infrequent voters. And so I think my challenge right now, and I think for a lot of folks, is how are we going to get low propensity voters out to the poll? Because that's not who traditional candidates and the party normally reach out to. They normally reach out to people who have a history of voting, especially during a midterm.
And I want to get into that a little bit more, but just taking a big picture look, has any other election that you've seen, has the Latino vote been this heavily scrutinized and fought over by both parties?
It has been this heavily scrutinized. I'm still on the fence. Is anybody really fighting for the Latino vote?
Say more.
Well, I think that it's, like I said, so in 2020, 51% of the folks that voted for Biden in the Latino community were either new voters or low propensity voters, 51%. As of 4 weeks ago, in Nevada and in Arizona, came a study out of NALEO, which is one of our sister organizations, close to 51% of Latino voters hadn't been contacted by anyone. But it's because the parties have to reimagine who they reach. Yeah. And in a place like Arizona, young Latinos are a larger vote share than their older Latino voters. Close to like 37%. So 37% of voters in Arizona are under the age of 29. Since the last election, we've had close to 80,000 young Latinos turn 18, just in Arizona. Biden won that state by 12,000. I was in Arizona last Thursday talking to university students at ASU, and they had voted, but they knew so many people that had sat out on the sidelines because they didn't know what the party had done for them on either way.
Well, what's the most frustrating thing you hear from fellow Democrats, operatives, strategists with respect to how they're understanding the Latino electorate or thinking of strategies to approach them this cycle?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the headlines that we saw since 2020 was that Latinos were defecting to the Republican Party. And so we kind of got on the case and said, is that true? And we did tons of research. And Gallup ended up finding the exact same thing that we found in early March. And it wasn't that Latinos were defecting to the Republican Party, is that they couldn't just tell the difference between the two parties.
Right.
So they had every intention of sitting it out. Well, that's fixable. One of the things we learned, for example, is that and this is a poll 2 weeks ago, 71% of Latinos believe in abortion access in ruby red states. It's the #2 issue in the Latino community. We've been doing this, we're 18 years young. We had never seen abortion access as a #2 issue. that's opportunity to have conversations on what differentiates you, especially in a place like Arizona and Nevada.
Right.
Georgia's, the Latino vote is healthy. It's coming out almost at the record numbers. In Pennsylvania it is. But when you look at where has the media concentrated their narratives, it hasn't been in Nevada, where you have a senator who is a second-time incumbent. It has been all on Georgia and Pennsylvania. And it's how do you actually make sure that those individuals are also being highlighted, in this case, Cortez Masto and the race there, because the individual running against her is very much a MAGA Republican. Something that we found in the poll that we just did 2 weeks ago was that 60% of Latinos believe that MAGA Republicans are a threat to democracy. Again, numbers that we had never seen before.
And I want to talk about that a little bit more. I'm sure people are like, what do you mean Latino voters say they can't tell the difference between the two parties? Both parties are consistently drawing this contrast. I feel like at this political moment, it is very clear the identities of both parties. I talk to Latino strategists all the time who say that they see in polls that Latino voters want and like priorities and policies that Democrats have acted on, but don't give Democrats credit for it or don't necessarily know that Democrats are the one who have delivered those things.
That's exactly right. And so one of the things that we did learn in the poll that I mentioned in March was that if a Latino had voted for the Republican Party, it wasn't on cultural issues. The number one issue was they can't tell the difference between the two parties, but Donald Trump signed my check. And so that gimmick worked. And for someone who is learning the political process, sometimes folks say, well, that doesn't seem very sophisticated. But it's more of people learning the political process. And I had to remind folks, he didn't sign your check. He signed your check, but it was your money. And they're like, oh, okay, and breaking it down. But one of the things that we are trying to understand more is 60% of Latino voters are under the age of 33. How are we teaching them democracy in spaces where media consumption is increasingly balkanized? You will hear individuals saying, well, we have tons of ads running in Arizona on television. I just told you that the majority of young people and eligible voters in Arizona are literally under the age of 29. They're not watching television.
Right.
They're on digital. We registered 650,000 voters in 8 states by not knocking on one door. It was all a digital strategy. And of those, 83% of them went out and voted as a digital strategy with SMS and radio. And so I think we have to modernize how we reach out to voters in this space, because you know who is trying to perfect that? It's the Republican Party on disinformation. And sadly, it's disinformation that they're peddling that oftentimes gets a lot of the Latino voters actually to stay home rather than to participate in an election system that they may feel like they don't understand.
And so do you think that Republicans have been able to attract more Latino voters over the last few cycles because they're better at mis and disinformation, painting Democrats as socialists who want open borders, or because their policies and the way that they're engaging with Latino voters is actually something that those folks want and resonate with?
Right. So again, Latinos are not monolithic.
Right.
And it's very important that we can park Florida and what's happening in southern Texas is a very different reality than the Latino voters that helped deliver Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and has actually made North Carolina at play. And what I mean by that is that in Florida is the only state where young Latino voters will never eclipse older voters. So older voters are roughly about 40% of that population in Florida. Latino youth voters are 16%. So they'll never eclipse. In contrast, if you see a place like Texas, Latino youth are roughly 27% of the population within the Latino community. They're 52% of the classroom. So all these voter suppression laws that you're hearing coming out of Texas and Arizona, they disproportionately impact young people and young people of color because of the volume of these individuals coming and becoming eligible, if that makes sense. And so folks say, well, what happened in southern Texas? Southern Texas, there was folks basically spreading information saying that Biden was going to abolish ICE, and that he was going to abolish the oil industry. Well, what are the 2 highest paying jobs in the south of the border? I mean, in the border region? ICE, the Custom Patrol, and fracking. Those are the 2. And so there was never a narrative to combat this. And I think now that the administration has receipts of what their actual intention is, there's an opportunity to connect and bring back that southern part of Texas.
In 6 days?
well, that's I demur on that one.
Right. And I want to talk a little bit more about the MAGA polling that you just mentioned. I'm sure you love seeing all these headlines that say the Republican Party is now the party of diversity, which they believe and say, and they're touting, the rise in conservative Latinas that they've recruited who are now elected members. How do you reconcile that with this polling that you have that is now showing Latinos turning against a certain type of or brand of Republican?
Yeah. I think one of the biggest, again, a lot of folks like to cite the MAGA Republican that won. She's Latina in South Texas. The part of the narrative, though, is that district was going to be consolidated anyway. And so when you have little resources, you are not going to spend money on a district that you know is going to be consolidated. What we do see, though, is that there's not enough effort in turning out existing voters. As I mentioned, 60% of Latinos are under the age of 60% are under the age of 29. By default, they don't have a voting history. And so one of the things that I really encourage the administration and the DNC is to talk about issues that these young people have clearly said they care about. They care about student loan debt. That forgiveness, the $20,000, up to $20,000, that wipes out the majority of student debt in the Latino community. Most folks don't realize that that debt is what prevents a lot of young voters from actually buying a home. We talk about millennials. Millennials are in their 40s, guys. They're less young every day. But if you're strapped with a student loan from when you were in your early 20s, it prevents you from actually accessing home equity lines and wealth. And so those were the challenges. But the other thing is that Latino youth are also part of what we call the sandwich generation. Because if their family they do not have access to Social Security or Medicare or insulin caps as the Biden administration has passed, that 22-year-old, 24-year-old has to decide, do I continue in school or do I drop out so I can take care of my parents? For the Latino community, Social Security oftentimes is the retirement plan.
I'm just curious as we look ahead, not just to November, but in 2024, you're talking a lot about sort of the multi-generational differences within the Latino electorate, highlighting the ways in which they're not a monolith. There are wide differences by education level, gender differences. Mm-hmm. Folks say that in order to sort of understand the Latino electorate, you need to be able to speak to a multi-ethnic, working class group of folks. I guess, one, do you agree with that? Mm-hmm. And two, some say Dems can do the multi-ethnic part, but not the working class part. So what do you say to that?
Yeah, I think that this is the bias oftentimes when we read a headline or we read a poll and say, well, the working class feels X, Y, Z. And oftentimes when people read the working class, they assume rural or white America. And they don't include the vast majority of Latinos. Right. Latinos became the second largest population in America in 2003. But we didn't age into a voting population until 2018. And so when we start talking about even this idea of why we have modern Jim Crow laws, it is because around 2018, folks realized that there was going to be a voting population that they didn't quite understand. Instead of adapting policy and trying to attract them, they decided to create barriers. Shelby County, which was which was Eric Holder, was the AG at the time. Shelby County is the one that presented the case to gut the voting rights. The most underreported story there was that Shelby County had experienced a 297% increase in the Latino population 3 years earlier, according to the census. 297%. And if you look at all the 22 jurisdictions that followed in those short order 3 months who had put these voting restrictions, they had all experienced at least a 90% increase in the Latino population. These are American-born individuals that happen to be Latino that are all of a sudden in North Carolina, they're in Georgia, they're in Pennsylvania, they're in Wisconsin. And instead, again, being adaptive, I would say either party. One party thought that they would be naturally Democrats, and another party, instead of really courting them around the lens of business and business specifically, because they're very entrepreneurial, they decided instead to create these barriers. And you ask, where do I see, a rise in the Latino community that will become more conservative? I would say it's not the Catholics. The Catholics, I often say, we're Pope Francis Catholics, right? Social justice Catholics. But where we do see this curvature is actually around the rise of the Latino evangelical. that are in very rural areas. And that is going to be a different story. And that you're going to see them on the rise, but the Democrats are going to have to figure out how do you actually have conversations to attract them as well.
Right. Well, we have time for one last question, and I want to make sure we get to it because Voto Latino has been involved in legal efforts recently in Arizona because of poll watchers, observers, standing outside of ballot drop boxes. Some say acting in intimidating ways. Tell us why you felt compelled to get involved in that and any other states that you're looking to for similar instances.
Right. I mean, every single American right now should be very concerned on what we're seeing in Arizona and other states. In Arizona, if you have not seen it, it's individuals that we are currently suing because they are standing next to ballot boxes in fatigues with face masks and guns and taking pictures of the people dropping off ballot boxes and taking pictures of people's license plates. That's very scary. And it's not by happenstance that they happen to be in disproportionately Native American regions and Latino districts. And it was because we saw a rise of folks' participation. In Arizona, it was close to 115% participation in 2020 compared to 2016. So there's enthusiasm, but if you're hearing stories that people are intimidating or that you could cause harm by approaching, that is why we're suing. And it became so severe that the Department of Justice just intervened yesterday. We have 2 lawsuits right now in front of Arizona. We have 4 lawsuits, in Texas. In Texas right now, if you are a college student, you can't register to vote on college campus because it's a temporary address. And you can't register to vote in your parents' address because you're physically not there. Talk about creating a no man's land. Since 2020, just in the Latino community, there's 250,000 more Latino youth that are eligible to vote in Texas. I don't know about you all, but I registered to vote on my college campus. And so one of the things that we need to figure out is how do we pass, in the lame duck section ideally, is some sort of voting rights law in Congress. Because I think we could all agree, again, regardless of political stripes, is that we should have universal laws for every single person, regardless of zip code, on how they can cast a ballot in federal elections, and ideally in local elections. And I also believe deeply that we have to also modernize our election system. This idea that you have to register to vote seems absurd. It's not a modern democracy issue. Look at New Zealand, look at Australia, where they all have almost perfect systems. And what's really interesting is when everybody has the need to vote through universal voting, the best part of it, the silver lining that I have found, Alexa, is that the political temperatures of the extreme actually go down. Because now politicians have to make sure that they're middle of the road and everybody has a better understanding of policy to win their vote. And I think we could all agree that the temperature is a little too hot. And so this idea that we could actually create systems and modernize our system so that we can get back to the business of the people is something that I think I would welcome, and I think many Americans would welcome.
Well, thank you so much for your time and your smarts. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Maria Teresa. Good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, hopefully you're not sick of me. I'm sticking around for one more interview. Have y'all been following what's going on in the UK? There's a little bit going on over there. Our next guest will help us break all of it down. Everything from the UK's new Prime Minister, whether he can bring unity and sanity to Britain and the UK, what that means for us in Washington, the war between Russia and Ukraine. Please help me in welcoming the UK Ambassador to the US, Dame Karen Pierce. Good morning. Hi,
How are
it's
you,
really nice to see you.
Great to see you.
Thank you for doing this.
Pleasure. Morning.
Well, last Monday, you were in Chicago. You were meeting with meat importers, talking about British lamb. At the same time you were doing that, Rishi Sunak was tapped as the latest prime minister. What news is going to break across the pond while we're sitting here together this morning?
Well, the Prime Minister's just announced that he will go to COP27, so I think that's a very good message. And he's put out a very good statement about the importance of energy security and the importance of tackling climate change. So he was always committed to climate change, tackling it, but I think it's a great message that he can actually go to COP.
We're no stranger to political drama here in the US, but there's been 5 prime ministers in 6 years. Why should the US trust and expect stability from the UK now?
Well, the 5 prime ministers in 6 years is an expression of democracy. And as the US's closest ally, we would expect democracy in Britain not to worry the United States. It's a different political system from the US one. Fundamentally, in Britain, you elect a party. You don't elect a prime minister, even though the prime minister flows from the leader of the party. So we are just as reliable as we have always been. Politics has now gone back into its usual groove. We remain a day one, night one ally for the United States, go anywhere, anytime. We remain the leading European member of NATO. We're still on the Security Council. We play a leading role in the IFIs, etc., etc. And we're doing great things on Ukraine together. So I think no one in the US should worry about the UK.
And as a representative of the British government, do you find that the political turmoil and economic turmoil has at all threatened the UK's credibility on the world stage or made your job harder?
I wouldn't call it political turmoil. It's the natural expression of the way politics works in the UK. There's now a prime minister with a government who's governing. You'll see that the economy is settling down, and we expect a budget shortly. So I think all of that is normal. Business as usual. There is a lot of economic difficulty at the moment for a lot of countries. United Kingdom's not unique in that. But we haven't found that it affects anything we do on the world stage. On the contrary, I think people look at what we're doing on Russia, Ukraine. They look at what we're doing on climate. They look at what we did on the pandemic. And they see a country they want to partner with. And I haven't found my job here more difficult. I've found a lot of questions about British politics. But that's all good in a way. It doesn't matter what they say about you as long as they spell your name right.
So you wouldn't have preferred things to go any differently over the last 3 months alone?
Oh, well, I'm a career civil servant, so we are independent, so I don't have a view, as it were. My job is America. My job is to strengthen even further the relationship. So we take what comes and we do the best we can.
You worked closely with Liz Truss when she was Foreign Secretary, before she became known more broadly around the world for her very short stint as Prime Minister. How do you explain to your American counterparts what happened during those 44 days in office?
Well, I think it all comes back to it being just a different political system, and it's an expression of democracy, and it's expression of how engaged I think people are in the politics of the day. And sometimes that leads to unusual results, but it is fundamentally an expression of politics deriving from the different system that we have in the UK. You know, you are not able, even should you want to change the American leader except in very clearly defined circumstances. Our circumstances are much looser. Both Labour and Conservative governments have actually changed the leader and hence the Prime Minister at various points in history.
Rishi Sunak is, of course, Britain's first Prime Minister of Asian origin. And he came to office just after Liz Truss was the third woman to be Prime Minister. Despite the close ties between our two countries, why do you think that American leadership hasn't been as diverse?
Well, first of all, I think it's a very good sign that we've had 3 women leaders and we now have the first Asian background leader. I think that's one of the answers to your questions. Are people worried about Britain? No, they see a dynamic, modern country picking modern-looking leaders. So I think that's fantastic. I'm not going to comment on who the American people choose as their leader. I think right the way across the US, and as we were just hearing from Maria Theresa, you have a very diverse political community.
A group of Democratic progressives recently sparked controversy by urging Biden to redouble diplomatic efforts with Putin to avoid nuclear escalation in that war. How does the UK view the diplomatic path forward in this stage of the war?
Well, we work very closely with the US on support to Ukraine so they can push Russia back in their own country. There will need at some point to be a diplomatic end to this conflict, right. But the onus is on President Putin. You know, he has to stop what he's doing, stop the invading forces, draw his forces back, and then be ready to sit down seriously. The Russians, in my experience, are past masters at offering things that are not real. They're also past masters at saber rattling. You know, the only person who needs to do something about nuclear escalation is Putin. The only reason nuclear escalation is even an issue is President Putin. So it's incumbent on him to make clear he doesn't use nuclear weapons in Ukraine.
And I want to get into that in a bit, but is it your view that it's solely up to Ukraine to decide sort of when to engage with President Putin, especially given that the West is providing billions in aid and support?
Well, we've been very clear, the President has been very clear that it's about Ukraine, and it's for President Zelensky to decide. We have lots of conversations, the Europeans have lots of conversations, the Americans have lots of conversations with President Zelensky, and helping Ukraine get to a position of strength, helping Ukraine restore its sovereignty is what we're all concentrating on.
President Zelensky recently said that Ukraine is ready for dialogue, but with a different leader of Russia. It seems impossible that Ukraine and Russia will ever come to a peace settlement with Putin in office. Do you see this war ending in any other way than with a regime change?
It's not our intention or plan to aim for regime change in Russia.
Sure, but
if I were Russians, I would look at what President Putin has done. You know, he's set out to re-establish the Russian Empire. He's restored the Soviet economy. He's brought NATO closer to his borders. He's solidified Ukraine as a nation. None of these things are great achievements set against what he set out to do, but it's for the Russian people to decide who governs them.
Putin has, of course, been sending mixed signals lately, as you were just alluding to, about the potential use of nuclear weapons as the next escalation in this war. The UK has warned that it would be met with serious consequences, change the nature of this conflict. President Biden has said that it would be an incredibly serious mistake. You've seen the way Putin operates. What type of consequence realistically would stop him, and what has been discussed?
Well, I'm going to be very boring here, I'm afraid, because if I were to set out the possible options, very possibly that would aid Mr. Putin's calculations. So that's one reason why we're not setting out what the range of options could be. But they do include some quite serious security and economic measures. But the real onus here is on Putin not to use nuclear weapons. No one else in the world wants to break the nuclear taboo. It would be appalling if the country that did so were a member of the Permanent Five of the Security Council.
Is there anything that, and I respect the reason for not wanting to talk about the potential consequences, but is there anything you think would be a misstep? Anything that you're like, absolutely not, this would of course provoke him. We should not even consider this.
I don't think it's possible to say that sort of thing in a vacuum or hypothetically. To be honest, Alexei, it's something, the future trajectory of the conflict is something we discuss with the Ukrainians all the time. It's something NATO looks at itself. We draw out various scenarios and we work out possibilities, but we're not at the stage where we want to make any of that public because it may help Moscow.
Sure. How have things been feeling? Of course, people here have publicly said that they're concerned about what Putin might do, concerned at the way he's raising these issues. How concerned are you? What is the vibe during these conversations? Is it getting more urgent?
I wouldn't say it's getting more urgent, and I don't think people here should worry more than the inherent risk involved in any use of any nuclear weapon, tactical or otherwise. So I don't want to say that the level of concern is going up, but Putin has put the issue out there, and therefore it's sensible that we look at contingency scenarios. But they are only contingency, and they derive from things Putin has been saying.
Liz Truss caused controversy as foreign secretary by claiming it was realistic for Ukraine to push Russia out of Crimea with weapons that the West supplied. Reclaiming Crimea has been labeled one of Putin's red lines, a situation that would certainly provoke him and could threaten his ability to turn to nuclear weapons even more. Does the UK support retaking Crimea if that's what Ukraine sees as victory?
I think we will take our cue from Ukraine on that. It's their territory. It's for them to say what a peace settlement might look like, and it's for them to decide where excuse me, where to draw the line around their territories. So
Sure.
I won't get into that. What I will say, if I may, about 2014 and Crimea, I think it's a very good example of how Russia pays only lip service to the international system. If they thought there was a real concern about ethnic Russians in the Crimea, they could have come to all the many instruments there are in Europe and put that question in front of a multilateral body who would then have been helpful in addressing any real problems. I think it's interesting that the Russians don't do that, but I also think it's very worrying in and of itself. If you like, Europe is the most lawyered up place for stability and security agreements. If Putin can do this in Europe, with all its Helsinki Act and OSCE and national minority protections, then where else might the Russians be adventurous in the world?
In your experience, do you think that Putin was easier to manage or perhaps more reasonable under President Trump than he's been under President Biden?
No, I don't think so, to be honest. I do think Putin is very smart at adjusting what he does to his interlocutors. There's a story about he would always have a dog when he spoke to Chancellor Angela Merkel, because she doesn't like dogs. But I think Putin's intent was probably clearer than we realized from further back. I was talking to somebody the other day who'd been at the 2007 Munich Security Conference when Putin actually set out there that he didn't consider Ukraine a proper country. And with the benefit of hindsight, that was what we probably all should have seized on.
Yeah. And do you feel at all that Putin has the same level of respect or any different level of respect for President Biden as President Trump, or it just simply was not there?
I think it's probably true to say the Russians don't really understand America at the moment. And this is interesting to me as a politico-military specialist, because back in the 80s and 90s, Russians and Americans had a lot of ways of getting in touch with each other, a lot of back channels, lots of track two. This particular Russian government under Putin backs away from all of that. And I think the consequence is they understand America less and less. I think that's an enormous pity and risk. I hope that when the Ukraine conflict is over and it's ended in a way that the Ukrainians are happy with, that we can somehow get back to load-bearing channels in the way that we had before.
Well, we have time for one last question. And as you know, the midterms are in 6 days from now. If Republicans take over the House, as they are likely to do, they have said that they would not write a blank check to Ukraine for aid, obviously throwing into question the U.S.'s continued support for Ukraine in this ongoing war. How would that change the UK-U.S. relationship, and what position would that put the UK in? Would you have to pick up the slack that we are no longer providing?
America is an incredibly generous country and has been incredibly generous towards Ukraine so far. There is no one who can step in and pick up funding that America supplies. There is more that the Europeans, including the UK, can do on burden sharing, and we're prepared to do that. And you've seen European countries say their defence budgets will rise, and that could include help to Ukraine. But I think I would say that conflict in Europe is inherently more dangerous than merely being a conflict because of Europe created 2 world wars. We have all these stability and security instruments. What happens in Europe has a way of affecting what happens in America. But I don't expect the fundamentals of American support to Ukraine to waver, even if the dollar amount is to change.
Well, Ambassador Karen Pierce, I appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for joining us and for your smarts.
Thanks very much for having me. Thank you.
Now, please welcome to the stage Axios co-founder Mike Allen.
Thank you very much. We're very lucky to have with us a doubleheader, the ultimate duet. White House Deputy Chief of Staff Jen O'Malley-Dillon, White House Senior Advisor Anita Dunn. This is a great treat for us. This is the first on-stage, in-person interview either of them has done since the administration started nearly 2 years ago. A tiny window into what our guests today have seen and done. Each of them has worked on 6 presidential campaigns. So listen to this. Anita Dunn started on the Jimmy Carter campaign. She was an intern for Jerry Rafshoon, was an intern at the White House, now a boss in the West Wing. Bill Bradley, John Glenn, Senator Barack Obama, President Obama, Joe Biden. That one turned out pretty well. Jen O'Malley-Dillon, Al Gore, where she started in New Hampshire and wound up in Florida for the recount. John Kerry, Obama, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, now President Biden, Jen O'Malley-Dillon, Anita Dunn. Welcome to Axios. Thank you so much for coming. Anita, thank you for coming.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you so much. So you both work in the West Wing, so this must be like lunchtime for you. Tell us where you're at in your day and what your day is like.
Well, it's lunchtime because of the West Wing and because I have 3 kids, so it's like basically evening already. But I mean, look, I think the day is well underway, as probably everyone here. Anita and I have the opportunity to work with amazing people that we've been together for a long time, a lot from the campaign, people over the course of the last 2 years. And, you know, at this point in the day, we're already past the news of the day. We're focused on what the president's doing today, our planning in the short term and in the long term. He's traveling all across the country right now, so we're really digging in on those details.
And Anita, what's a day like for a senior advisor?
Okay, so first I have to give Jen a little truth here, which is she starts her day so early because she is a Peloton fanatic.
That's
okay?
true too. That's if you want to talk later about Peloton.
Yeah, but I'm just saying that when she introduced herself to the campaign, when she joined the campaign, her welcoming speech to the campaign raised Peloton in a very prominent way, and she has not backed down. So she's an amazing person who gets up so early every morning and exercises, which I do not do. So just full disclosure. But my day is a lot like Jen's up to this point, except I'm dealing with fewer operational details because Jen actually controls all of the operational things that happen in this administration, which is a gigantic job and only one of her many jobs. You know, I start my day early because I'm reading a bunch of clips. What a shock, right? And working through what the administration is saying on any given day, what is happening across agencies, making sure everything comes across in a coherent fashion. And by the time we get to this point of the morning, we're usually through 4 meetings at least. So.
And at Axios, at our retreats, we have a feature where we get to know our colleagues by saying, what the hell do you do? So Jen, you start. What the hell?
That's a great question. You can answer that in one way in that I do a lot of what Ron Klain tells me to do. But I'm the Deputy Chief of Staff, and you know, I spend a lot of my time, as Anita mentioned, doing a lot of the operational elements of the White House, but also, in addition, overseeing a lot of the outreach elements of the White House.
We're often on the road, always on foreign trips.
Yeah, I travel exactly on all the foreign overseas trips. We have a big one coming up shortly. I'm often traveling, you know, when there's a natural disaster happening across the country, and the president and the first lady are traveling. Anita and I often travel together on that.
And Anita, you do what you want.
I love my job. I get to work with amazingly creative and just smart people who do press comms and digital in the White House. I get to work across policy areas and work with just incredibly smart people every day, which is a great part of the job. So.
Axios always starts with the news, and we have some breaking news being made on the Axios stage. President Biden tonight will give a speech on democracy, and I understand he's going to lay a factual predicate. Jen, give us a sneak peek.
Yes, well, obviously, President Biden has been speaking about democracy for the entire time he's been in office and before then. I think you can expect to hear from him this evening, similar to what he's been saying over the course of the last several months, that there is a lot at stake, including democracy, and that everyone has a role in that. I think the other thing that will be really important, and something you heard from President Biden in 2020, was that people are going to be able to vote. Over 25 million already have. They are voting all across the country. In some places where we will have a lot of attention, focus, the votes will be counted and will take a few days to be counted, because that's how democracy works, to make sure every vote is counted. So he'll highlight that as well.
For those who are tweeting along at hashtag Axios events, thank you for this breaking news. And what's the setting and why?
He'll be making the speech from Capitol Hill. And why will he be making the speech from Capitol Hill? Because on January 6th, we saw violence geared towards subverting democratic processes there. So it is, it's an appropriate place to make these remarks tonight. And political violence, the threat of political violence, which most Americans find abhorrent, the idea that you would use violence to further your political means. It's something that unites almost all Americans and that we can all be united against. And obviously, we've seen horrible things happen quite recently, the speaker's husband. But it's from Capitol Hill because that is where there was an attempt to subvert our democracy.
And Anita, my reporting indicates President Biden is increasingly willing to take on these forces. He seems to be warming to being aggressive, proactive about this.
No, I think the president believes that you have to name it, that you have to be very straight with the American people, as he likes to say, from the shoulder. And he will be very clear tonight that he is speaking to people who don't agree with him on any issues, who don't agree on his agenda, but who, we really can unite behind this idea, this fundamental value of democracy.
Is that a Bidenism? Say it from the shoulder, or what's the expression?
There's a bit of a Bidenism.
What is the expression?
To be very, it means to be very direct.
Say it from the shoulder.
Yeah, from the shoulder. Mm-hmm.
Also, news and in your clips this morning, Anita, Washington Post, front page, will Biden run again? A yes plan takes form. President Biden and the First Lady have been meeting in the residence, getting a 2024 re-election campaign going. This paragraph caught my eye. Anita Dunn, Mike Donovan, Jen O'Malley, Dylan have been involved in the planning discussions, as has Chief of Staff Ron Klain. Jen, what are those sessions like?
Well, first of all, I would start by saying everyone has heard at this point, the president speak publicly about his intention to run in 2024. And, obviously, as I think you mentioned when we came out here, between us, Anita and I have had the opportunity to work on it.
Going for 7.
Well, we are very pleased, as we've said, with our current roles. But, obviously, there's a lot of work underway. The president is extremely focused on delivering for the American people, but also very focused on what's at stake in this country, and I think accomplished an extraordinary amount. But as he talks about, there's more work to be done, and he's very focused on that.
Yeah.
Anita, you've known the president how long?
A long time. A long time.
Going back to when?
Going back to the 80s, when I got my first job in the Senate, and actually got to know his chief of staff, his then chief of staff, Ted Kaufman, who was just a wonderful human being. And then I was at the Democratic Senate Campaign Committee in 1990, which was when then Senator Biden was in cycle. So
you know the president very well, the First Lady very well. What we're hearing is that they'll probably make a final decision, family meetings around Thanksgiving, Christmas. Does that sound right to you? We'll probably know by New Year's.
Well, the president, with the president, family has always come first. And, his decision to run in 2020 came after a family meeting that was actually, as he tells it, called by his grandchildren. Pop's got to have this conversation. So, the family is going to be deeply involved in whatever decision he reaches because that's who he is.
So when would you expect or look for a formal declaration, a formal re-election campaign?
Well, we're not going to get ahead of the president on this one. But I would say, obviously, he has said he intends to run. we are engaged in some planning for the simple reason that if we weren't engaged in planning in November of this year, we should be in the Political Malpractice Hall of Fame, right? So
New Year's, we'll know by New Year's-ish.
we'll know when the president tells us.
So the West Wing talks a lot about these 2 years as the foundation for what's to come.
Right.
The next 2 years in the administration. Looking past the midterms, Axios' Sophia Kai was the first to report that the administration was launching a talent search, expecting turnover in the cabinet, other top officials. Jen, how is that talent search going?
Well, I mean, look, first I would say that I believe President Biden's team and administration has been together longer than any before him. And that's truly a testament to the president. You know, he is someone that really instills in all of us that our jobs are to do our jobs and to stay focused on it. And, you know, as someone who has worked in this business for a long time and, you know, been on campaigns and now on the official side, I certainly have never been with a group of colleagues that I feel so respected, that we're such a great team and that we are just really focused on the work. So, you know, we are proud of that. I think the president is proud of that, but also expects that in all of us. And, you know, I think it's just good government to make sure that you're thinking ahead. The transition that the president put forward as president-elect was the most consequential and significant, considering the situation that he was walking into, the number of people, and as quickly and as qualified that he was able to put in place, you know, is a testament to that planning, and that's what you see here.
Are you finding that people want to come in, or some cold feet?
No, I mean, look, I don't know anyone who wouldn't want to be part of making someone's lives better every day. And for someone, again, you know, my whole life has been campaign work, my adult life. Before that, I was like a normal person. But this is my first time in government. And so I spent my entire career before now talking about how to help people, talking about those issues. And now every single day, because of the president's leadership, we do that. And so the people that are part of this and helping make that change are the people that you'd expect and you want to see, and everyone wants to do that.
Anita, between next week's midterms and the new Congress at the beginning of January, there'll be a lame duck session of Congress. What are the president's priorities for that?
Well, the government needs to be funded, and that's a huge priority. But there will be other priorities as well.
What else would you look for?
You know, I think that there will certainly be discussions around additional aid for Ukraine. You know, the ambassador was on before us talking about the progress there. But, you know, this is, as the president said nearly a year ago when he spoke to the American people about this, you know, it is a critical battle that we must win, and that we will give that support to Ukraine until it is over. So we'll be looking at that. We'll be looking at additional COVID aid. And, you know, COVID is with us. It will continue to be with us. Now, we don't have the aspects of the horrible pandemic that we had 2 years ago or even 1 year ago. You know, 1 year ago, if you got sick, very few cures, right? It was still extremely terrifying. Now we have cures. But we need to get people vaccinated.
Yeah, within that COVID aid bucket, like what's going to be important to you? What's going to be the headline?
Well, what is important, and what is actually important to everybody in this room and everybody who might be watching and everybody in this country, is to continue to do the research and to develop the new treatments, the new vaccines. If you are an immunocompromised person in this country right now, you don't have the luxury that many of us have of kind of having resumed so many of your normal activities, that the new variants, for instance, don't respond to a lot of the treatments. So we need to stay ahead of this virus. And that is what Joe Biden has done since he became president. He has pushed his administration to make sure we stay ahead of it and that we're not continually trying to catch up to whatever has happened.
Jen, the White House counsel's office has been staffing up, expecting more investigations, and the off chance that there's a House Republican majority, you certainly are expecting that, getting ready for it. How will you handle this onslaught of investigations that they've promised are coming?
Well, look, I think President Biden has been abundantly clear that his number one focus is continuing to move forward and deliver for the American people, and he's not going to.
But while he does that, like the staff is going to be confronting like a real wave of investigations. Like you already have more lawyers for it. How are you planning to navigate that?
Well, I think that President Biden has been clear that he is confident that we will continue to have a Democratic House and Senate.
Mm-hmm. And Mike, at the end of the day, the president's priority is going to be progress for the American people, bring inflation down, continue the economic growth, which is creating a record number of manufacturing jobs, nearly 700,000, making it in America again, making the investments that are going to make sure this country is leading the world in the future economy. And those will be his priorities, as Jen said, to make everybody's life better. And people in this country will judge other priorities accordingly.
Anita, you spend a lot of time with the president behind the scenes, and one investigation the Republicans have promised they're going to spend a lot of time on is Hunter Biden, including calling accountants. What is that like for the president personally, and how does it affect him for his son to be in the headlines like that?
No, I think, as the president has said when he's been asked about this, he loves his son. His son had a horrible disease that unfortunately too many American families are familiar with, the disease of addiction that, Hunter has come out on the other side and is doing very well, and the president is proud of his son. And these issues were raised during the 2020 campaign in really horrible ways against him, went through an entire impeachment process because of the former president raising these issues around the president's son. And, I think voters kept their eye on priorities back then, and the president will continue to keep his eye on the priorities of the American people.
And do you believe that will happen again?
I think that, as the president has said, we expect a Democratic Congress. So.
No, but with the president's son in the news, you were saying that voters moved on. Do you expect that would be the case again?
Mike, I think that there are very few families in this country who either haven't experienced having someone with addiction or don't know someone who has had the disease of addiction. And the president is proud of the way his son has come out on the other side of this. And that is something that Americans understand. And they also understand who's looking out for their priorities and who is going to be fighting for them. And that's what the president does every day.
Jen, you mentioned your adult life has been spent in politics. A zoom out question here, and our political managing editor, Margaret Tallov, mentioned this to me, that if you look at polls, a lot of America seems to be moving to the left, whether it's on gun control, whether it's on abortion, whether it's on the racial reckoning. The country is becoming more center-left. There is zero indication of that in politics. Why that disconnect?
Well, we could have a whole discussion about how I feel about polling, if you want to take it in that direction.
But you don't dispute that there's been this shift in the country. It's been clear that the country has a different view of gay marriage than it did not too long ago.
Yeah, yes.
And yet, we're not seeing that in our midterm trends. What do you make of that?
Look, I think that the American people are focused on what's happening to them. And I think that what you're seeing, and you see this from the president as he's talking and traveling the country, he is laser focused on what impacts a middle class family in this country and a working family. And he has, both focused on what they've gotten done in order to support making their lives easier, lowering costs, but also that there's more work to be done. I think the American people want to see us working across the aisle. That was part of what he believed and what he knew to be true, and what has been able to bear out when it comes to manufacturing, as Anita mentioned, veterans bill, the gun bill. So I think what the president has been able to do is talk about all sides of that. People are full people. They're whole people. This whole idea that you can only talk about economy or abortion, and people are just going to only listen to one thing. The American people, codifying Roe is critical whether you're a woman or you're a man, and it is not a 50-50 issue in this country. So certainly we are in that direction. And also, I think that's a significant issue in addition to how people are feeling about their daily lives and the economy. And I think the president has been very clear on that and really led on how to talk about that, and also talk about the clear contrast that exists in the country. And I think he set the tone from that and has been able to make that very clear to everyone.
One more question for each of you, and then we're going to wrap up on the topic of contrast. Anita Dunn, contrast. President Biden, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis.
Oh, where do you start? President Biden believes in trying to unite. And when he ran for president, he said he was running for 3 reasons: to restore the soul of the nation, to rebuild the backbone of the nation, the middle class, and to unify the nation. And this is a divided nation, but he will never stop trying to unify the nation, as Jen said, to reach across the aisle, to look for that common ground where we can move forward together. And if you look at Governor DeSantis, since he's been governor, he is a divider. He looks for places to go divide the people of Florida, to try to line up one side against the other. And that's just very different from the way Joe Biden sees the world, and certainly very different from the way Joe Biden defines the role of president of the United States.
And last question for Jen. You used to run the DNC. You know how these decisions are made. The president hasn't been seen in Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, a lot of swing states. He gave kind of a prickly answer the other day when a reporter asked him about this. He was asked about where he's traveling. He said, count. Does he feel he's being underutilized in these final days?
Well, the president is out there all across the country. To be honest with you, I barely can keep up with his schedule. I mean, he was in Florida all day yesterday, is headed to Philly on Saturday, is going to be in the Midwest, is going to be on the West Coast. You know, and he's been traveling across the board, really focused on telling the story about what he and Democratic elected officials have gotten done for the American people and driving it home.
He's not telling that story in large rallies in big swing states as is traditional, as President Obama did, as President Trump.
Well, I mean, Pennsylvania is a big swing state, and he'll have a large rally on Saturday. So I don't debate your point that, of course, like if you look across the administration, First Ladies in Arizona, you know, the president believes we have to be everywhere, and that the administration is out there across the board. And whether you're in Arizona or you're in Nevada or you're in Pennsylvania, all of the Democratic elected officials that are communicating to their constituents are talking about the things that they got done for the American people that are built on President Biden's vision and what he's accomplished. And that is a significant difference from other midterm seasons.
Everybody here has a boss. What's it like to tell your boss, the campaign doesn't really want you?
I've not had to say that, so I don't know. No, look, I mean, the thing about President Biden is he has been campaigning his whole life. And what he knows about engaging with people is that you need to be out there and talking to people and really he says all the time, don't tell me about a big piece of legislation and a historic passage. Tell me about the story and why that matters to people. In 2018, he did that and helped make sure that we were able to have that contrast. He also understands that he is a bully pulpit that nobody else has, and that's why he's going to continue to make that contrast. It was his leadership in May that set out that MAGA, as he would say, ultra MAGA extreme agenda.
MAGA.
Right, mega MAGA.
I believe you coined that.
No, I did not coin it. No, I was part of a project when I was outside of the government that, you know, was looking deeply at Republican elected officials, at how they describe themselves, at their agenda, at a wing in particular of Republicans who had espoused certain beliefs, starting with denial about the election results in 2020, and looking for an effective way to shorthand all of that for people. And interestingly enough, in our research, you know, as always, the American people tend to be ahead of the political consultants, right? This came very organically out of research, listening to people talk about what they thought was the problem with some of these Republican elected officials. So,
and the term that emerged from those verbatims was
MAGA, was as a way to encompass the election denial.
But wait, was it ultra MAGA or mega MAGA?
Well, it was MAGA, but you know, you can always improve on something.
Put some flair on it.
Yeah.
Yes. As we say goodbye, Anita Dunn, you're often mentioned as potentially the first woman in American history to be the White House Chief of Staff. Are you ready to make history?
So, Mike, let me be really honest with you. I like the job I have. So I have the best job in the White House, I think. So,
if, as every White House Chief of Staff in the history of the country has done, Ron Klain moves on, would you consider moving into that suite?
I hope Ron Klain stays as long as Joe Biden is president. There has never been, I've worked with several different chiefs of staffs, and I've certainly observed a lot of White Houses. And, you know, Ron's ability to do so many things at the same time is something that you rarely run across this. And he is, you know, both as a colleague and a friend, and as someone I've worked with for years, there is no better chief of staff. So So my hope is, Mike, my hope is he stays just as long as President Biden does, which means poor Ron is in for another 6 years. Okay.
But no Sherman statement from you refusing to make history.
No, I'm doing Sherman's statement right here for you, okay?
Jen, a hot hunch, a race state trend that it will be a pleasant surprise for your fellow Democrats on Tuesday.
Well, I think it's going to be a pleasant surprise that we feel very optimistic about what's happening out there. And back to my polling point earlier, we, I think, do a disservice. This is my little TED Talk moment. We do a disservice to this country by leaning in on polling so much
You
is...
think Democrats are doing better than the polls show?
I do, and I also think that polls at this point, it's all noise. It all means the exact same thing. And we have had a polling system that was broken in 2018 and 2016. So what I say to everyone out there is to be confident, show up and do your job, and participate in this democracy, as the president will said, and we will be in a good place because of his leadership and the path forward.
At Axios, we always end with one fun thing. If you weren't in politics, you would be...
Oh, I would totally be a softball coach, like 100%. I don't know if I'd be any good at it, so I'll just say that. But I played, and my daughters are 9, soon to be 10, and they're on a team, and I'm like working very hard to not be that crazy lunatic mother, but also make sure, because they're identical twins, pitcher, catcher, combination, can you imagine it? Like college scholarship, here we come. All right, tune back with me in a few years. I'll tell you how that's going.
And Anita, if you weren't Anita Dunn, you would be?
Oh, I'd love to be a sportscaster. I'd love to travel with the Nationals, be that person who knows, the ins and outs of all the players, and be thinking about West Palm.
And what's your dream for West Palm? Spelled out for our.
Oh.
So the little context, the Nats, which who won the World Series in 2019, not the worst in the NL East, not the worst in the NL, worst in the MLB.
We're rebuilding.
And yet, your dream is?
There's so many young players on this team who are so much fun to watch. And just also an Orioles fan, because obviously there were years when we didn't have a baseball team here, and we all root for the Orioles, so I root for both teams. And if you look at the Orioles this year and you think about where they were as recently as 2 years ago, when they were the worst team in the league, and you look at young players developing, my wish for the Nats is maybe a pitcher or two, a starting pitcher or two. Yeah.
Drop the mic. Thank all of you for coming out. I thank my Axios events colleague, my Axios journalistic colleagues are here, everyone on the incredible Axios events team, and thank you, Jen O'Malley-Dillon and Anita Dunn, for a great conversation.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you all for coming. See you on Axios.com. Thank you.
Thanks, that was fun.